Hello and welcome to the Asian Peace Talks. This is a podcast series launched by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. The goal of the Asian Peace Program is a noble one: to try to preserve and strengthen peace in Asia. With our limited resources, we have to take a modest approach. Nevertheless, just as a small acupuncture needle can make a big difference, we hope that our monthly policy essays and this podcast series will make a big difference and strengthen the peace regimes in Asia. I'm Kishore Mahbubani, the host of the Asian Peace Talks. For the fifth episode of this podcast series, we are delighted to interview one of ASEAN's best known and most distinguished diplomats and scholar, Dr. Marty Natalegawa. He's a former foreign minister of Indonesia, a scholar of ASEAN, and clearly one of the biggest champions of ASEAN. During a decorated political and diplomatic career in Indonesia, Dr. Marty has served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2009 to 2014, as Permanent Representative to the UN 2007 to 2009, as Director General for ASEAN Cooperation, and along with various other distinguished titles and directorships. Dr. Marty is also a distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. In addition, and I encourage you to read it, he's the author of the acclaimed book on ASEAN entitled Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within, published in 2018. We are therefore very, very happy to have with us Dr. Marty. Welcome to our program, Dr. Marty.
Thank you very much, Kishore. Thank you for having me in this discussion. Thank you.
I'm going to begin, by talking about a subject that is very close to your heart. You've always emphasized the importance of ASEAN centrality if we are going to keep peace in Asia. Sadly, there have been some recent developments that are beginning to erode ASEAN centrality, and I hope we can discuss them frankly and honestly in this program. One of this, of course, is the recent AUKUS agreement that has been reached between the UK, US, and Australia, which involves providing Australia with nuclear submarines. As you know, the Indonesian government has also expressed some concerns about it. It said Indonesia is deeply concerned over the continuing arms race and power projection in the region. And you too, Dr. Marty, were quoted in the Jakarta Post article that said that AUKUS is a reminder to ASEAN of, and I quote, the cost of its dithering and indecision on the complex and fast-evolving geopolitical environment, unquote. So I was going to ask you if you can explain to our readers, to our listeners, what is your big concern about AUKUS? How does it undermine ASEAN centrality?
Well, I think one must approach these types of subject matter in a broader context. We recall how over the years ASEAN's place in the wider region has evolved considerably. From essentially a group of countries that are pawns in major power rivalries, we gradually earn and assert our centrality. And you would recall, initially the centrality was mainly manifested as a convening power, the ability of ASEAN to be host and to convene events of great importance where countries, large and small, were able to gather and have exchanges of views. But as you know, in the golden era, so to speak, of ASEAN's diplomacy, we saw how ASEAN's ambitions and contributions went beyond simply convening powers to ASEAN capitals. We began to set the norms and principles for the conduct of states in our region. But I get the sense that in recent years, notwithstanding all the tremendous contributions that ASEAN has made, there has been an impression of dithering and impressions of ASEAN being adrift, and as a result, not able to meet some of the expectations that have been placed on it. And as a result, we are seeing platforms or processes such as AUKUS and the revival of the Quad, for instance, coming into being. I'm not saying by saying all these things, we are not at all assuming as if there has to be only the ASEAN way, that as if the entire region's architecture must be fully an ASEAN-led or initiated one. There's always room for so-called minilaterals, but I get the impression AUKUS is only the latest of this gradual erosion almost of the centrality of ASEAN, and ASEAN must be, in an honest manner, discuss and deliberate on what all these developments imply in terms of its relevance.
Well, thank you. I must say I share your concern about ASEAN dithering, but I'm also very glad you spoke about a golden era of ASEAN cooperation when ASEAN was involved in setting the norms for the region. Can you just tell the listener, many of whom are not familiar with ASEAN, what were you referring to when you spoke about the golden era, examples of how ASEAN set the norms?
Well, in terms of the easier one, in a way, is simply the processes. I mean, the type of cooperation that ASEAN made possible, not only intra-Southeast Asia, but we initiated the dialogue process relationship with countries like China, Australia, New Zealand, the so-called dialogue partner, United States, etc. But more than simply ASEAN and third countries, by having these ASEAN-led processes, we actually help connect those countries that had otherwise been apart previously. For instance, you would recall, no doubt, Kishore, that in Northeast Asia, there was no +3. There was no, Japan, Korea, China, however fragile that type of cooperation is, prior to an ASEAN +3 process. It was ASEAN that actually helped instill a sense of a tree among the Northeast Asian countries. And, as a result, we allowed this type of cooperation to take off. And within the ASEAN Regional Forum, for instance, the participation, although again extremely tenuous sometimes, of the DPRK in the ASEAN Regional Forum is extremely important, because it provides a foothold, a possibility for diplomatic dialogue between all the key parties on the Korean Peninsula issues that would otherwise be absent completely. And so convening power, we have ASEAN have enabled all these processes to take place. But more than convening, I think we have had an important impact in terms of norms and principles. The most obvious one is the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, the idea of non-use of force and peaceful settlement of disputes, initially only among Southeast Asian countries, but then the non-Southeast Asian countries acceded to this treaty, and therefore reinforcing and respecting Southeast Asian countries' commitment. But the work unfulfilled is to actually have similar commitment among these non-ASEAN countries, to have a similar TAC commitment between say, India and China, China and United States. This is where I felt that there was, I feel that there is a work unfulfilled on my personal part, that I had really wanted to connect those outer dots and make sure that the ASEAN transformative experience is extrapolated to the wider region. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. In fact, what is interesting is that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is created in 1967, so it's already 54 years old. But the Northeast Asian nations have not been able to create an Association of Northeast Asian Nations,
right? Yes.
ANIAN, to match ASEAN. And what's even more remarkable, as you pointed out, that the +3, China, Japan, and South Korea, couldn't even talk to each other in a group until ASEAN came along and created that format. And of course, ASEAN has, in my view, delivered a geopolitical miracle by persuading China, Japan, and South Korea to actually sign a free trade agreement among themselves under the umbrella of the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So this is a concrete example of how ASEAN is actually making a concrete contribution towards not just improving peace, but delivering economic growth through the regional comprehensive.
I was exactly that, Kishore. I mean, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, again, is a very concrete manifestation of how ASEAN managed to establish link and nurture or initiate a type of cooperation that had been absent before. And so these are extremely important. And you know, if one think back, there was a time that when both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia were two regions severely divided, the countries, relations between the countries. But whereas in Northeast Asia, they essentially remain divided and absent any regional cooperation. In Southeast Asia, that has been the opposite. The case has been the opposite. We have ASEAN to transform our region's dynamic.
You're absolutely right. And of course, I remember when I was ambassador to the UN in the 1980s, I spent a lot of my time arguing with the ambassador of Vietnam over the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. But yet, by the time I went back as ambassador to the UN in 1998, Vietnam was already a member of ASEAN. It was quite an amazing transformation.
I know. All this take place, Kishore, within our life, not only our lifetimes, even more compressed within our career in foreign ministries, in diplomacy. The amazing transformation that ASEAN had made possible. The ASEAN 10, although of course, people can still debate and ponder whether ultimately whether it was, it was a good idea it must have an impact on ASEAN unity because the ASEAN 10 is obviously far more diverse than the original ASEAN founding members, but at least we are all under one common tent. And however difficult our relationships are, differences that we may have, at least the notion, a security community, so to speak, exists in the sense that all the problems that we have will be resolved by non-use by diplomatic means. And this is where I think one of the thoughts that I have had in recent years is that premised on the recognition that geopolitical rivalries and contests is perennial and inevitable, almost conditions ahead of us. Even taking that into account and recognizing that there is still potential for ASEAN to manifest its centrality today by trying to stabilize that relation, those geopolitical tensions between the so-called major powers. This is what I've been trying to speak in favor of. You spoke in your initial remarks about the aim of your institute on peace, waging peace. You have to wage peace as aggressively as countries wage and prepare for war, for conflict. And in this connection, I feel ASEAN, irrespective of the fact that our foreign policy orientations are so varied and different, and the fact that the major power contests are here to stay, essentially, surely there is still room for us to promote the idea that all these differences must be resolved or managed, if not resolved, by peaceful means. I hope ASEAN can rally around this notion.
I know I share your hope too, but I think Dr. Marty, you cannot give Indonesia too much credit. I can give Indonesia too much credit. I believe that the Indonesian culture, musyawarah and mufakat, consultation and consensus, is a very healthy culture that has actually now entered into the ASEAN spirit. And that's why you find even after ASEAN's expansion to 10, which as you said, creates challenges in trying to create unity and consensus, still it has been able to function well. So the question I had for you is if you can explain to some of our listeners probably haven't heard about this Musyawarah and Mufakat, consultation and consensus. Can you explain to them what is this Indonesian culture and how it has benefited ASEAN?
Well, I think essentially it is, if I was to manifest it in terms of interstate relations, diplomacy, so to speak, is constantly seeking through communication and dialogue to identify convergences and to accentuate those issues or those areas where we have commonality of views, we have common views. It's rather simple and easy in a way to accentuate differences, but the art or the effort to find convergences and to find consensus is quite a difficult undertaking, and this is what has marked Indonesia's diplomacy in the past. Notwithstanding our factual objective position within the region, we have always been at pains to ensure that we speak in favor of finding consensus, finding convergences among states, and in a way, as you have so generously described, it does manifest the traditional internal Indonesian disposition. It can be a bit tricky nowadays, I guess, Pak Kishore, because as you know, ASEAN is now moving toward the so-called rules-based as a rules-based organization, and the institution wants to modernize itself and having certain structures and legal framework and instruments on decision making, etc. The charter obviously is the obvious manifestation, but I hope this is not at the expense of the so-called ASEAN way, because it's often case the informality of dialogue makes possible the take and give between countries that would otherwise be extremely difficult. Looking at what's happening now on Myanmar, for instance, I wonder to what extent the restrictions caused by the pandemic, the COVID, in terms of direct communications have made the take and give process that is required far more challenging and difficult. You are talking over like we are doing now over virtually over Zoom. How can you have that kind of a more direct interpersonal diplomatic efforts? But it is how things are at the moment, and makes for the job of a diplomat, I'm sure, far more difficult than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What I remember most fondly about the ASEAN meetings that I attended, and I attended ASEAN meetings for over 30 years, was the informality and the camaraderie, and even at the golf games.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I was going to ask you maybe a slightly delicate question. The Anglo-Saxon world has great difficulty understanding how this informality and camaraderie can make a difference. And if I remember correctly, Dr. Marty, you got your PhD from Australian National University,
yes.
So you're very familiar with Anglo-Saxon culture, Anglo-Saxon views. And I have sometimes found it very difficult to explain to my Australian friends that this easygoing, relaxed ASEAN way of doing things is actually more effective than trying to put everything down into concrete agreements and so on and so forth. So in your interaction with your Australian fellow academics, scholars, or even diplomats, do you find, how do you try to explain the ASEAN way, as you called it, to an Anglo-Saxon mind?
Well, I think one of the key thought that I always try to suggest is the notion that there is no one size fits all. Every situation is unique and requires its own approach, and you wouldn't want to try to impose on a unique setting the experience of a different situation. And I don't think there is one methodology that is better than the other, the informal versus the so-called formal, because I would like to that, for instance, the Jakarta informal meeting on the Cambodian peace process, right? I mean, that was eventually manifested, concretized in the Paris peace agreement. Prior to the formal process, of course, we've had several stages of informal, Pak Mohtar, the late Indonesian foreign minister's process of so-called cocktail party among the warring factions, and then leading to the Jakarta informal meeting, and then step by step, together with Australia, actually, Pak Alatas, the late Pali Alatas, and Foreign Minister Gareth Evans and others made possible the Paris Agreement. So I think, in a way, the so-called informal and formal must, in the end, and converge and strengthen one another. But certainly, I agree with you that in the ASEAN context, the informality of the communication process can be extremely valuable. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Gareth Evans. He's also a good personal friend of mine.
Yes.
And I actually work with him. As you know, I also work with Pak Ali Alatas very closely. And there was a time when I think the Australians were converging towards the ASEAN way of doing things. Now I begin to fear that Australia is diverging away from the ASEAN way of doing things and gravitating towards things like Quad and AUKUS and so on and so forth. So, as you know, the Australian scholar, Professor Hugh White, has been saying for quite a while that maybe Australia should consider changing course. What's your view on all that?
Well, when I mentioned this on several other occasions, when we within ASEAN we thought about we were thinking about the East Asia Summit that eventually came into being in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. There was going back and forth whether the East Asia Summit was only to be made up of the ASEAN plus three, the ASEAN plus three meaning ASEAN and then China, Japan, and Korea, to be the precursor to an East Asian community, so to speak. And I remember at the time, Indonesia and actually Singapore as well made a strong case that we must include right from the beginning India, Australia, and New Zealand, because we felt that that's better encapsulate the future dynamics, scope of the future dynamics, not only East Asia, but although the term wasn't used, but Indo-Pacific, because those three countries represent ASEAN's outreach to the Indo-Pacific. But the point being that after a great deal of efforts, Australia was included in the East Asia Summit right from the beginning, and we work hand in hand very closely to be part of that effort to create what I called in the past a dynamic equilibrium. But their most recent developments does indicate Australia has chosen, in the dilemma that they were facing in terms of economic engagement, strong economic engagement with China, security traditionally with the United States, they have chosen the path of closer alignment with the United States. It is an important call by them, but I hope it's not like it will not make their orientation too unidimensional, and that they can somehow still play a more nuanced and a more calibrated position. It's interesting, for instance, how, for instance, New Zealand, of course, a different country than Australia, and in terms of its orientation and priorities. But it's interesting to contrast how a country like New Zealand, for instance, manage the type of dilemma it's facing in a quite delicate and calibrated way. Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, Dr. Marty, I attended the lecture you gave at the Lee Kuan Yew School 24 hours ago or so. And I remember you saying that ASEAN was successful in some ways holding off the Quad 10 years ago. How do you think ASEAN managed to do that?
Well, basically by making the platform of choice, I mean, the process of choice that we were promoting and suggesting a relevant one for all concerned. The East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, you know, I mean, I remember when the United States, we were trying to get the United States, I mean, early on, when the East Asia Summit was set up, almost basically immediately or even before it, Russia wanted to join as well, almost immediately, basically the same time. But we, asked to have a bit of a pause because we wish to have Russia's admission to be concurrent with the United States to ensure that there is it's well calibrated and there is an equilibrium in my language, in my parlance, so to speak. But I mean, and we had to encourage the United States to say that this is a forum that is of great benefit to all concerned. And I remember having to deal with questions, quite a mechanical administrative question. They were saying, well, I mean, does it mean they have to have a commitment every year to attend a summit in the region? But I said, well, you have to turn up at the very least if you were to matter, and they had to accede to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation beforehand. But yeah, and the way the summit was organized was made we made sure that it was like a quality time, that it was something that was worthwhile for leaders from all around the world to come together and to deliberate and to exchange. But I think as the more the process becomes regular and there's a great deal of preparations and outcomes prepared at the officials level, it loses that element of value adding for leaders who are extremely busy doing other things to actually be coming to the summit. So in a way, concurrently with the East Asia Summit and ASEAN Regional Forum, etc., showing signs of leveling off, we are seeing this the Quads and the AUKUS now coming to fruition. It's not only those two. China also has initiated its own processes, the One Belt, One Road, contrast to ASEAN's connectivity efforts. So I think it is symbolic of the fact that if ASEAN, it's like ASEAN is almost like on a treadmill. It's constantly moving. So even to stand still, you have to keep up with the pace of change, and let alone if you're standing still, you'll be left behind. And I feel at the moment this is where we are, and to the point that I said yesterday, that if you were in a driving seat role, behind the steering wheel, you have to have the initiative where you are heading. Otherwise, the other passengers will say, okay, they get off the car and they find other modes of transportation. This is what I think happening at the moment, it seems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think let's hope that ASEAN's centrality comes back in a strong way again.
Yeah.
Ascot, since this is the Asian Peace Program, as you know, we are part of, you are one of the region's, frankly, best peacemakers we have seen. And I remember that at a time when the two of our members, Thailand and Cambodia, had some challenges over the Priya Viha temple, you very bravely and courageously undertook shuttle diplomacy and actually went to see both sides. And at the end of the day, you were able to achieve peace at that border. Since the goal of the Asian Peace Program is to provide lessons on how to secure peace, can you share with our listeners what you learned as a result of trying to bring peace on the Priya Viha dispute?
Well, I mean, by way of context, I do recall when I was still serving at the United Nations, when Indonesia happened to be a member of the Security Council at the time. And at the time, actually, we had two ASEAN member states in the council, Indonesia and Vietnam, which was quite a rare occasion, since then repeated again. But we were both a member of the Security Council. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2008. And there was a similar incident between Thailand and Cambodia. And then the matter was brought to the Security Council President's attention by, I believe, Cambodia, written a letter to them asking for Security Council engagement. Thailand naturally opposed it. And here we were, two ASEAN member states in the Security Council, and we didn't have a common script. There was no ASEAN position on the matter, and it was quite galling to have to be sitting in the council as two ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, with the world expecting we have some solution to offer as a region. It was absent, and I do remember going back and forth with my foreign minister then, Pa Hassan Wirayuda in Jakarta. Is there a regional approach? And there wasn't, unfortunately. There was no unity among ASEAN. That's why when the issue reoccurred again in 2011, early, within a month of Indonesia's chairmanship, and there was another incident that was becoming extremely serious. And I said to myself, okay, this time I want to do some things a little bit differently. I want to be sure that we have an ASEAN script, and that's why, I mean, without waiting for, if I wanted to be precise, probably I should have written to all the ASEAN member states, asking whether I should be going to Bangkok and Phnom Penh to communicate. But I thought if I was to do that, then I can be certain that the whole thing will grind to a halt. There will be the traditional going back and forth or etc. So I simply, I mean, perfection can be the enemy of the good. So instead, I just hop on the plane and then went straight to Bangkok and Phnom Penh, turned up there and said, look, I just need to know what your respective perspectives are. And this, in terms of lessons learned, and to your original point about informality, Pa Kishore, is I remember upon seeing my two colleagues from Cambodia and Thailand very much in a listening mode. One thing I did deliberately and purposely was not to take any notes and not to have any papers to try to demonstratively record what they say and try to come up with some kind of a declaration or as an outcome, but keep things entirely to myself. And then at the end of my tour, I sat down and I wrote to all my ASEAN colleagues and I said, these are the impressions that I have of the two sides' views. And these are the impressions that I have of the road ahead. And I said, unless you are, violently opposed to these impressions, I will proceed in this way. And thankfully, those impressions that I have that I carefully tried to recall and record in my mind was of sufficient, was sufficient to have the ASEAN member states rally around it. If I had been more precise and trying to draft an agreement, draft a declaration, and then presented it back and forth, I'm sure you wouldn't have been able to quickly arrest the worsening dynamic. Only then, and then subsequently, interpersonal communication between the two sides become extremely important. But to me, that episode reminds of the importance of timing. When you have an issue that is fast developing, you have to respond quickly and not allow the situation to fester. And secondly, the importance of informality and the trust of the parties concerned. Because I remember from the Cambodian side, they were keen to describe my efforts as being ASEAN's effort. Thailand doesn't want it to be an ASEAN, it wants to be Indonesia's effort rather than ASEAN. So we have to play with words in terms of drafting documents to be sure that both sides are happy with the approach. Yeah.
Well, I must say that's a very good example also of how ASEAN informality and flexibility helps a lot in sometimes solving problems, which would be difficult to solve if you follow a very strict rules-based approach, which I guess would be the Anglo-Saxon approach.
Yes.
But we have about 5 minutes left, I think, in this podcast. I wanted to end on an optimistic note because, even ASEAN, of course, we all know is a very imperfect organization. But still, its overall track record in preserving peace in Southeast Asia, in contributing towards peace in East Asia, in contributing towards economic development of ASEAN, economic development of East Asia, example through the RCEP is phenomenal. And it is certainly much more successful than other regional organizations like SAARC in South Asia, where India and Pakistan still don't have normal trade with each other, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, where some members are suspended, like Qatar, and I can go on the list. So, what if you were talking to your counterparts in South Asia or in the Gulf, or even in Africa elsewhere, and they ask you why is it ASEAN does a better job of cooperating? What would you say are the reasons for ASEAN success? What would you mention to other?
First of all, I agree with your characterization of ASEAN's past, Pakishore. Without any doubt, ASEAN has had tremendous contribution to our region. It's been transformative for in changing relations between Southeast Asian countries, transformative in changing the dynamic or the place of Southeast Asia in the wider region, and transformative in the economic dimension as well. And that is without doubt has been the case. The only remaining question is, how can we in the next 5 decades, so to speak, of ASEAN help not only consolidate and secure those achievements, but take ASEAN to higher level in terms of addressing the future types of challenges that is continuing to face, the geopolitical ones, as well as external ones, the type of internal situation it faces that has regional ramifications. So yes, tremendously successful, but no room for complacency in terms of taking things for granted. But to your specific question, I'm afraid I have to keep on reverting to the fact that obviously every region, every situation is unique. What has been successful for Southeast Asia may not translate well to other regions. But if I was to pick one key element, must be a sense of regional ownership of the entire project. I mean, it would have been easy for countries of Southeast Asia to continue to, on the path of where they were, having a region becoming increasingly divided and torn apart, not only between themselves, but also by extra-regional powers' interests. But ultimately, countries of Southeast Asia decided, look, this is not in our interest, and we need to develop our own regional capacities. And I guess this is one of the key ingredients to have a sense of responsibility and ownership of what's going on in our region, and to have the leaders with courage, and courage in terms of not taking things as they are, but trying to change things for the better. And I think if you think about all these great leaders of ASEAN past, that made possible all these important documents that have been so transformative, I think they are all united in one fact, in the sense that they envision a region of, they have a certain vision of the region of the future, rather than how things were in their era. So I guess it would be wonderful if that kind of trace can be replicated elsewhere as well.
I'm glad you emphasized the important role of leaders. I was actually, by the way, a participant in the first ASEAN leaders meeting in Bali.
Wow, 76.
I attended the meeting. And as you said in your book, if I remember correctly, there was a rather unusual friendship between President Suharto of Indonesia and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore.
Yes.
And that friendship among leaders also was a key factor. So I think, I must say, we in ASEAN should consider ourselves blessed that we've had in the past great leaders, both at the heads of government level and foreign ministers level. And Indonesia, I must say, has always produced many brilliant foreign ministers, including Dr. Marty, who have made a huge difference to the evolution and the strength of ASEAN. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you,
Dr. Marty, for your excellent contribution to this podcast. I think people who listen carefully to you in this podcast will find that there is a lot to learn from ASEAN that they haven't noticed before. And I thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us in this program. And I want to conclude by saying that to remind our audience that the Asian Peace Talks podcast is brought to you by the Asian Peace Program, a part of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. I should also add that Asian Peace Talks is produced and edited by Bertrand Sia and Dr. Varigonda Kesava Chandra. Goodbye. Thank you very much.